Thanks for joining us today and welcome to our webcast, Combating Adversaries, Proactive Social Engineering and Network Testing. While you're with us today, we are going to dive into the benefits of implementing proactive social engineering and network testing with your organization. Here's a quick look at our agenda. We'll set the stage for a deep dive into social engineering and look at two different threat scenarios that originate from social engineering tactics. We'll round out our discussion with a look at offensive security solutions that proactively improve security postures against social engineering. But before we get started, let's introduce our speakers. My name is Aleth Dennis. I'm a senior security consultant here at Bishop Fox on the Red Team. I'm most well known for social engineering, but focus now predominantly on physical pen testing and incident response, tabletop exercise facilitation. I'm a Black Badge recipient and quoted in the Wall Street Journal and featured in a Darknet Diaries episode.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Lincoln. I've worked in security for 12 years, specializing in reverse engineering and pen testing. At Bishop Fox, I lead one of our consulting teams, as well as doing hands-on testing.
Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Rush, security consultant for around a decade. I've had the opportunity to do network, some social, some app, physical, wireless, and cloud penetration tests. Currently oversee a team here at Bishop Fox as well, in addition to doing some field work and trying to make everything around me better.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Reagan. Over my years as a pen tester with Bishop Fox, I've had the pleasure of delivering email-based phishing, malware-focused social engineering attacks, physical penetration testing, but I've always been really interested in what are the technical controls that could mitigate those risks, especially things that could detect or prevent these types of attacks. So excited to explore those more today.
All right, let's get started with setting the stage a bit and get into a look at social engineering and how these sorts of attacks can threaten our organizations. This is mostly an opportunistic scenario where we identify as attackers any potential ways that we can compromise an organization through their people rather than trying to go up against technical controls. So with end users, we're talking about humans that are emotional beings. They are typically classified as our weakest link, and I really hate that we say that, but it is the truth. And as companies have advanced their technical security controls, we're seeing an increase in the popularity of social engineering incorporated into these types of attacks. So I wonder if the team can elaborate a little bit on the evolution of social engineering and how that's emerged as a prevalent strategy for hackers.
Yeah, I can start off there, Leaf. I am of the personal opinion that this has existed since the beginning of time, ever since there's been essentially a social interaction where perhaps one party can gain some level of perceived benefit to themselves by doing some sort of action. So kind of with that as the foundation and looking forward to perhaps more modern times, whether it's the phone freakers or the SIM swap fishers or the rote email spammers that just try to, do that percentage-based thing. If they send out so many, they're going to get so many clicks, or perhaps the more sophisticated and targeted spear phishing attacks. It's been effective over time and continues to be effective. So I think that's one of the large reasons we're here talking about it today anyway. Ben or Rob, you got anything there?
Yeah, I'm happy to give some perspective. I think that what it really comes down to is sometimes the easiest way to get something is to just ask for it. I always think of a organization that we worked with that after their first year of us doing social engineering testing, they changed their policies, they changed their processes, they changed their controls for the password reset process. They made it so that you had to have the start date of your employment, and you had to tell the help desk your social security number. And never mind the problems with that, but we basically found an employee's recent start date that they had posted about on Facebook and impersonated that person. And then since we didn't know their social security number, the help desk thought that it might have been entered wrong whenever we joined, and we should call the finance department and get it fixed. So we just called the finance department and asked them to read back to us what they had for our social security number so we can tell them if it was right. And so sometimes just asking is the easiest way to get what you need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think humans have been scamming other humans since the dawn of time, but I think social engineering is becoming more of a conversation topic in the media because of the emphasis on that vector in most recent breaches and security incidents that we've heard about. Do you have any techniques of social engineering apart from phishing attacks that maybe we want to discuss and bring to the front of this conversation? I know, Rob, you mentioned calling the IT help desk and posing as a newly onboarded user.
Yeah,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Okay, yeah, sure. I was just gonna tack on to that one with, let's say we start with a phishing campaign, and some users actually do end up filling it out. One of the things that I like to follow up with is just a phone call to that user, asking them to perhaps run some other software because they felt susceptible to that first social engineering attack. So this might be known in some security lingo as the double tap or zombie lingo. But just the idea that you've essentially established a level of rapport with that individual, because how else would you know that that person got a phishing email if unless you were perhaps working within the systems? But it turns out that we were actually the ones that sent that phishing email to begin with, and then following up via a phone call can be a great way to work around multi-factor authentication. Just by having that particular end user run the malicious software instead of perhaps trying to log in over VPN with stolen credentials. So phone phishing is absolutely a thing there. Rob?
I always liked as well, just trying to be helpful. Really, I found that worked best. One thing that we would do is, like you said, send an email to set the stage that, hey, we're going to be installing some patches on machines today. Normally I would come by your desk in the office, but I'm actually sick today and I don't want to get you sick too. So if you could, I'm going to send you this link, and then if you click it, it's going to give me like remote access to your desktop, and then I'll install the patch for you. Or if you want, you can just download this MSI file or exe file and install it yourself. And again, I just don't want to get you sick. So I'll just, avoid coming by your desk. And a lot of folks were very helpful in installing malware that way.
I also want to highlight the importance of human psychology in social engineering. And I think, Rob, you hit the nail on the head there, because that pretext uses the authority of the IT department over your average user to then dictate what I'm allowed to do in that environment. So posing as the IT person saying, I need to update your computer. Most average users wouldn't challenge that because they're not an expert in that field. So the psychology and the ability to build rapport, and also just being friendly and nice and likable, goes a really long way. Ben, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to reinforce the being helpful aspect. One of the most successful phishing campaigns I was ever part of, the client had told us we couldn't use any fear-based techniques, and so much of phishing and pen testing seems to go along those lines. So it felt like a big constraint, but it actually ended up being really interesting. And we came up with a scenario where we sent this whole campaign where we were posing as our IT department, kind of like Rob suggested, but we were saying, hey, we know your current remote access solution is a hassle. You've got to enter your credentials all the time. You're part of this pilot to try something new where you won't have to do that. You'll just turn on your computer, you'll sign into remote access automatically. It'll all be taken care of. Yeah, worked very well.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to leverage that. We covered some in-person social engineering, and we covered voice phishing as well as email phishing. I think baiting is one of those shadier, manipulative types of actions used in social engineering to try to entice someone to take an action. And quid pro quo, I want to highlight really quickly, because that is probably one of the most effective human behavioral psychological elements that you can use to manipulate someone. And that is this for that is the direct translation of quid pro quo. And that's just the giving of something and the expectation that the other person would return the favor. And that's something that we all find extremely compelling. If somebody gives us something, we just have this urge that we can't satisfy until we can return that favor. And oftentimes attackers will ask for information by giving you information. And it's something that's a little bit tougher to spot because we have that knee-jerk reaction to try to satisfy that need to return it. So moving on, how are advancements in AI and machine learning influencing the dynamics of social engineering attacks, in your opinions?
For me, the most interesting aspect is, like so many other applications of machine learning, it's now possible to automatically generate new and unique content every time, maybe even on a per user basis. And you'll have a result that looks at least superficially convincing, which is enough for most types of social engineering attack. So defensive tools that rely on signature definitions or other pattern matching, they've been challenging to maintain for as long as I've been in security. But to me, this feels like the tipping point where that approach is no longer going to be effective, and we'll need new types of tools.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm also noticing the giant statistics on the side of the slide here, and the 135% increase in social engineering attacks leveraging AI is probably going to double, I think, over the next year as these tools become more available.
Yeah, I think. Oh, please
go ahead, Rob.
I recently heard of a friend from a friend that they knew someone that was affected on the personal level by an extortion that leveraged generative AI to make an audio recording of what sounded like their daughter's voice, and that they had been kidnapped. And they unfortunately sent money to this scammer as felt like their loved one was threatened, and it made a very compelling audio recording of the daughter basically saying help, and it worked. They asked like what could be done to defend against this, and honestly the only thing that I could think of is technical control, like something like having Find My Friends and enabled so that they could check the location of their family in an event like that, or just using some out-of-band way to verify that what's really going on. So that I think we'll see more of those types of scams, especially as chatbots prey on people in ways that they always have, but just in a more automated and convincing manner.
Yeah, those are, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to tee off that's interesting that you mentioned that particular situation, Rob. There's with people posting to social media and things like that, and where the large language models are at now, there's essentially the capabilities to create phrases that are statistically likely that person would make to begin with, given what they post on social media, right? And then with that in combination, that it only takes about 2 minutes of a voice recording in order to make a voice clone. There's this kind of technology stack that would then involve creating kind of a catered large language model specifically towards an individual that would produce phrases like they would typically post on social media, and then being able to feed that into a text-to-speech system that gives those sort of sound clips where it might be asking to reset a password, or saying, hey, I got phished, or perhaps saying, hey, can you transfer some money from a position of authority? Yeah, I do think that's just going to become more and more common, where there's this sort of personalized social engineering attempts that might sound like your mother is desperate for whatever they posted about on social media lately. And just to kind of take advantage of those threat vectors there, it will just become more and more common as that technology becomes more and more commoditized and easily available.
Absolutely. I noticed we had a question here from the audience. Our employees are trained monthly, and we have a great email security tool. However, the onesie-twosie attacks that are getting in, they just scan the QR code, input credentials, et cetera, and do not fall back on their training. How do we bridge that gap?
That's an interesting one. Yeah, including QR codes within emails does sound like a natural evolution. Typically a lot of the link parsing solutions that'll go over an email and perhaps translate it to some sort of link filter to try to determine if it's malicious or not. I would think that that's being completely circumvented by QR codes. I'd be curious if any other panelists here are aware of maybe perhaps just technologies that would allow one to exclude QR codes, or perhaps to just not include images from remote locations.
The first thing that comes to my mind is having another technical control like a multi-factor. So even if they enter their creds into the phishing site, that it should trigger a out-of-band second factor of authentication. And at that point, your incident, and if they say like, wait, that I'm seeing this from a different source, or I didn't get the multi-factor when I put those creds in. These can be things that help trigger an incident response for the security team to jump in and investigate what's going on, perhaps identify the phishing site, and then sinkhole it and block it from other users visiting it.
Yeah, great ideas. Let's move into our first scenario. We're going to talk about phishing and ransomware. And could we detail a hypothetical scenario where an ordinary email phishing attempt escalates into a ransomware attack? And for our example, we'll be using Black Basta ransomware.
Yeah, sure. I could start with one there. So from an initial access point, if we do start there, the delivery mechanism, at least in this case, was just a macro that was delivered via a Word document. So from an initial access standpoint, if we unpack that a little bit, one, it is relying on some of the social aspects that we just discussed around whether or not a user is actually going to click on something. But once they do, some other controls come into play, maybe software restriction policies, or perhaps some group policies related to just simply not allowing macros to execute on the user's system. So yeah, the user might have made the wrong decision with opening that document, but if they continue to make wrong decisions, are there various technical controls that should be on the side of this next slide here to prevent. So there's just a couple of examples there on where that has happened. And I think one more down is going to be the initial access side of things, and just kind of how this one in particular started and went from that level of initial access to the execution within the context of that macro. And then some level of reliance on whether or not that endpoint detection and response solution ended up actually picking up that activity to begin with. So, these controls, I think, do kind of relate to both preventative and detective controls. And it's always a good idea to layer both of those. Ben, would you maybe want to take the next one there around discovery? What happens once execution takes place?
I think I'll pass on that one, Derek. This is a little outside my area of expertise.
Okay, sure. Rob?
Oh. Sorry, what was the ask?
Just kind of teeing off here after initial access, what kind of happens from a privilege escalation standpoint in the context of this example, just to kind of key the audience in on, a recent real world example that, yes, Office macros are still a thing, and kind of what happens after after initial access there, which is typically related to privilege escalation, taking stock of perhaps the things that we end up with from an access standpoint once we do get that initial foothold.
A lot of it's additional discovery at that point. It's we're looking for a way to pivot and gain additional privileges. Sometimes those may be other valid accounts. Sometimes those may be looking to assume the role of another insider. And at that point, what you have is an unintentional insider threat scenario, because we've stolen the credentials of maybe an engineer, or someone in the finance department, or someone in the sales department, that now we have access to everything that they have access to. And it's really becomes a challenge to mitigate the risk of data leakage at that point, or data theft, because it looks like the intended behavior of that employee. Although there can be controls that can help mitigate those risks, including behavioral analytics of those users, or looking for commands or programs that are running on their machines that they don't typically run. Like often there's not really much use for a sales employee to be running like netstat on their computer to discover other services on parts of the network. So that might be things that you can flag on as part of your incident response to mitigate the risk of a compromised internal account.
Yeah, and let's take a look at the last one here. I believe it's the last example for this one, just related to lateral movement. So once that process of privilege escalation does happen, and just to recap, we've got a user, they got an email, they clicked a macro, some level of code execution took place, bypassed all the defenses, and now we're kind of in this scenario that some security vendors like to call maybe an assumed breach scenario, or where there's just a threat actor on the inside of a network. So from a lateral movement standpoint, this is one I have some pretty strong opinions about. I think the amount of companies that I've actually seen network segmentation at the kind of host level is one organization that did effectively do that, where from a lateral movement standpoint, that's an absolutely great control to prevent systems at the network layer from communicating with systems that they don't need to. Or perhaps another way to say it would be least privilege at the network layer. It is such an effective control, and I feel like a lot of organizations focus heavily on authentication and authorization as it relates to least privilege. But where this can really go wrong is least privilege at the network level. So if we contrast perhaps two different situations where in the first situation, maybe an organization that doesn't have as mature of a security posture, we would have a threat actor that just has access to absolutely everything in the organization. They have access to all the IT administration network segments. They have access to all of the server network segments, just all the things. And if we contrast that with maybe least privilege from a network standpoint, let's say we're a customer service representative and we only have access to the bare minimum amount of things that we actually need to do, such as maybe the phone system, maybe a wiki, maybe a couple of web portals, and that's it. So if we contrast those two situations, the amount of attack surface in the first one is going to provide so much more opportunities for lateral movement than in the second, where there's only a handful of services to attack. So yeah, a great control is micro segmentation, just as it relates to preventing lateral movement. And some of those things there for, it would limit the ability to perform collection. It might limit the ability to perform exfiltration. And it might even limit the ability for command and control if there is least privilege from an egress network traffic standpoint as well.
Are there any other types of preventative technical controls that could be deployed to prevent an attack like this? I think a lot of folks have the misconception that you click a button and then ransomware happens. But there's actually quite a process that happens after that phishing attempt is successful. And the attackers could be exfiltrating passwords, they could be exfiltrating data, they could be snooping around in all kinds of areas. And I think that's why it's so important for us to emphasize this culture of reporting and not holding our employees accountable for making the mistake, but rather supporting the action that they should take after they make the mistake. If they feel like an email looked weird and they're worried that they put their credentials into something that they shouldn't, if something weird happened on their computer, all of these things can help to minimize the damage and potentially avoid the eventual encryption of all the systems and the ransomware itself. I know a lot of times these things can happen very quickly, but do you think there are any other technical controls that could help prevent things from moving through that discovery phase into the execution?
Happy to take that one again if Robert, Ben are empty-handed there. Yeah, so outside of microsegmentation, really just preventing the things or only allowing communication to things that actually require it. Let's say that that's not in place. So we'll take that first example of just an organization that maybe didn't enforce least privilege at the network. Let's hope that they enforced, let's say, least privilege from an authorization standpoint on file shares. So there's a very myopic scope where this user only has access to the specific documents that they need, and they don't have access to anything else. And these things have been backed up regularly, and they've been tested regularly, which I think we'll be talking about here in a bit, and some approaches to that. So in that scenario, the ransomware would really just encrypt what that user has access to, which might just be what's on that file system. And now if we maybe look at an organization that has a less mature security posture as it relates to file level permissions, maybe they have, there's like one overarching role that gives a lot of access to file shares and the resources therein. So in that instance, the ransomware would have a much greater level of impact on that organization, because that one user that got compromised has so much access. You know, in a worst case scenario, maybe it's like a domain administrator in the terms of Active Directory, perhaps using that as their daily driver account. They get compromised, and then it's likely at that point the entire environment would be compromised in short order. So having good credential hygiene and you know, making sure that the credentials being used are limited to only what they need access to do their job can go a long way in limiting the impact of ransomware in the event that a lot of the ransom where controls around preventative and detective types are realized.
I think that's a great call out to have admins have an admin account that has privileges to do admin things, but that they aren't using that account as their daily driver. And they have a separate user account that they use for their normal daily activities that don't require that level of access. Fantastic point. So how can organizations ensure quick recovery and business continuity during or post-attack?
One control that I think a lot of organizations neglect is having an effective disaster recovery plan and testing at least annually. If you can restore your business from an air-gapped backup in the event of a natural disaster, then you also have at least one reliable option for recovering from a ransomware attack. Maybe you also have less drastic options, but at least there's that fallback. I used to work in IT for a retail corporation, and they could restore business critical operations from tape in about a week. So it pains me to hear stories of multi-month recovery processes for organizations dealing with ransomware.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great point. I think having a policy for incident response and for disaster recovery is a lot different than having an incident response plan. It's a lot different than having a business continuity and disaster recovery plan. And it is light years away from having folks practiced in those procedures. And I know that we all groan and roll our eyes at the thought of doing tabletops, but at the end of the day, it is extremely important that people know where the plan is, have the ability to get the plan. If there's no physical copy, that's a big problem, because if all systems are encrypted, where's your incident response plan? So making sure that folks have access to that they know what it says and what to do, and that plan has processes that are valid and that make sense. So testing those plans ensures that not only are folks trained to use them, but that they actually make sense. Should this person be notified now? Should this, external stakeholder be brought in now, or should it be earlier in the process? Discovering that through a tabletop is something that can be extremely valuable. But it also gives folks the ability to know that that plan is dependable and not leave people flying by the seat of their pants during an incident, which is what you absolutely want to avoid. All right, moving into scenario 2, we're going to talk a little bit about insider threats. There has been a 41% increase in insider threats from 2021 to 2023, which is staggering. Overall, the annual cost has risen to $19.6 million. And I think we think about insider threats usually as malicious people who want to cause damage. But I think this also includes folks that are either blackmailed, bought, their access is purchased by an attacker that is external to the organization, or unwitting. In some cases, you have unwitting insider threats, meaning they're not aware that they're doing anything wrong. They made a friend online, and that friend offered to review their latest presentation, for example, and that is how that attacker is then lifting intellectual property from the company in a very helpful, well-meaning sort of framed pretext. But if we're talking about insider threats from more of a typical type scenario, how do we feel that social engineering plays a part in insider threat scenarios? That's the broadest question ever, but I'm going to throw it to the panel to answer.
I think that getting a really good handle on where sensitive data is, having data classification, and having a solid handle on who at the organization, even if they are a trusted insider, should or shouldn't have access to key information is a really difficult thing to manage for any organization. And it takes a lot of maturity and a lot of investment across the board in risk management to have a sense of who actually needs what to do their job. But like, I'll give an example. Like, I was talking to a CISO recently that was like very worried about data going into like a particular SaaS service that their data science team had. And it was surprising to them as they thought about it more that actually the data science team has too much access and has so much access to information that they could be accidentally emailing it to the wrong person. They could be accidentally putting it into like a personal GitHub account, into like a Google Drive account or Google TensorFlow account that isn't, managed under the overall organization security controls, let alone be, social engineered into giving it into to someone that shouldn't have it. So I think it really does start with some of those fundamentals of data classification, and do your insiders really need as much access as they have to do their day-to-day job, or should you be giving them sanitized data or data that's gone through differential privacy or processes, or should you be giving them something that they can still do their job with this like synthetic version of that data, but then we don't have copies of production data all over the place, or our super secret sauce, in the hands of too many people, even if they are full-time employees.
I think that's great. I also think separation of duties is very important. Having those checks and balances in place, especially when it comes to sensitive processes or updating code that is critical to the function of certain applications within the organization. We've seen some employees that have updated company source code without any double checks to that and causing issues on the back end, either creating access for themselves after the fact, after their departure from the company even. So ensuring that folks are having their work checked can go a long way to preventing this, because in my opinion, everyone has the potential to be an insider threat. It can be the most trusted employee ever, and they have the potential to be an insider threat. If they are given the right means, motive, and opportunity, they will take the opportunity, especially if they see a sense of entitlement to something that they're not receiving compensation-wise, or they're annoyed with management. These types of things over time, that builds up to a level of acceptable risk in their eyes. Like, nobody's going to see what I'm doing, so I might as well just take advantage of this one little gap that I found. And most of us aren't familiar with every single step in somebody's daily processes that they complete. And so having multiple people in that role and that oversight to make sure that those gaps aren't being exploited by employees can go a long way to prevent that. Just like you're less likely to binge eat an entire bucket of cookies if somebody else is home. It's the similar kind of an idea. Just having that oversight will make it less likely for people to try to complete those actions and accept that risk because they don't want to be caught. So are there any other protective or preventative technical controls that we can put in place to essentially remove as much risk as possible from insider threats centered around these social engineering attempts?
Yeah, I'll just quickly throw out there to really stare at that least privilege bullet point and, just think about how that applies to the network, authentication, authorization, and how if, that least privilege really is enforced. And I feel like it gets mentioned a lot in the security space, but really unpacking that idea and taking the time to implement, host-based controls to provide that level of micro-segmentation or just really strict role-based access controls can go so far. It's not some new technology that's gonna solve all your problems. It's been out there a while, but the how effective it gets implemented at organizations is usually not to the degree that it can be to prevent some of these impacts that we're talking about as it relates to insider threats, whether they're knowingly an insider threat or perhaps more commonly unknowingly, as in they got phished and their credentials got stolen.
Another control that I think works really well is having honey tokens, having honey pots, having tar pits, tools of deception in your network, that there's no legitimate reason for this to ever be accessed or used. And that can give you some indication that there is an insider threat, whether they're intentional or unintentional. This can really help you trigger an incident response, and also obfuscating some of your most important secrets. For example, like if you wanted to hide the Coca-Cola recipe, but still have your employees interact with it, you could do something like change the ingredients to different representations, like this is just ingredient K or this is just ingredient P, but you don't actually know what the ingredient is, but you can still talk about it in like code or like an obfuscated messaging. And this can be really effective to give people just the information they need to know, but not all of the information that would help like protect a secret.
I would
Are there
also.
any? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Elise.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think it's also worth looking at what data the organization collects and how it's collected. So are there things that just don't even need to be captured? So for example, I was on a red team project some years ago where from a technical perspective, the organization had locked almost everything down extremely well. But we found a multifunction printer with default credentials, and we're able to redirect scanned files so that we would capture a copy of any document that was scanned on this device before it went out. And the business process was for HR to scan documents and email them to themselves from this device. And so we ended up getting lucky, and it was right around hiring time. And so we captured just tons and tons of scans of people's passports and other government IDs. Things like that would be super useful in a phishing campaign, having that kind of convincing data. Do they really need to be scanning those? And if so, is emailing the documents to themselves the best way to handle that kind of sensitive data? Maybe not.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Actually, one of my favorite phishing campaigns is to pose as a scanned document from one of those multifunction copiers. So poll for the group, are there any indicators of potential insider threats, and how can we detect those early on? These can be behavioral or related to their activities on the network. For example, departing employees, sometimes you'll notice there's a large spike in data that they are downloading or exfiltrating, emailing to themselves at their own personal email, things like that.
Yeah, to take a step back to something that Rob mentioned that I think deserves a little more attention is the idea of canary tokens, or what I've heard referred to as overlay honeypots. And I've actually been caught by a couple of these during pen tests with astute clients that deploy these devices to their network. Maybe it's something homebrew, maybe it's in one of the solutions out there that's some vendors sell. But the general idea is that it's essentially a system that's on the network that no regular user should ever be interacting with. So when we got hired to do that security work, we are expected to do hacker things. And part of those hacker things would be doing a reconnaissance on the network that we're intended to target, right? So doing port scans and things of that nature. Well, they picked up on us pretty quick because we just happened to port scan a system in a user subnet that was kind of acting as that canary token, so to speak. So, I think it had like an open SMB share and maybe some data on it that purported to be payroll or something, just something a little juicy that if I'm doing my job correctly, I should be looking at that and I should be kind of opening it up. And yes, it worked to catch the pen tester, and the client reached out and said, "Ha, gotcha." It turned out that the bot was actually misconfigured. They had it domain joined, and we could do some RID brute forcing to essentially discover all the accounts. So, if you do use a technology like that, absolutely make sure it's configured correctly, not connected to the domain or anything like that. But outside of maybe physical devices that you put out there, or even, it could be a virtual machine, maybe a vulnerable virtual machine, something along those lines that has essentially, if any network connections are established to it, the organization should be asking questions. And one other one might be tucking in a user account with an Active Directory that just never gets used. A common thing that hackers will do is iterate over the entire list of Active Directory users. So if, as a Blue Team Security Operations Center, if you see authentication attempts being made to that honey token or that canary token that's stored with an Active Directory that doesn't belong to any user, its only purpose is there to see who might be poking around an Active Directory or who might be trying to authenticate as a user that they shouldn't be. That is a great indicator that there's some activity going on that needs to be investigated. So having those sort of detective controls overlaid on top of your real environment can go a long way to detecting insider threats. Were you thinking of anything else there, Rob, when you mentioned that idea?
Absolutely. I think being able to create ways for alerts to initiate an incident response because you've detected some anomaly on the network is key. And this can be a token or a credential that there's no legit use case for. It can be even a LinkedIn account. I really like the concept of having a fake LinkedIn account for your organization. It's a fake employee, fake name, fake everything, fake resume. But giving them an actual email alias so that you can record any email messages that they receive. These are either going to be probably unwanted recruiters or unwanted sales outreach or phishing attempts because an attacker has likely scraped your LinkedIn list. And you can use that to basically sinkhole those types of emails and make sure they don't reach any of your other legitimate employees. Another anecdote that I wanted to make is piping all this back to your SIM, piping this back to some dashboards where anomalies can be detected by your security team. And maybe you have some playbooks and some automations that can help triage these for the first few steps, but then you have a SOC analyst that's going to make some decision whether to treat this as a high severity incident or not. I actually was doing an internal pen test for a bank one time, and we were in the network for a few days. We had gained access to a lot of sensitive information. We had set up our C2 and our implants on several different systems, but we wanted to try to trigger an incident on purpose at this point. And so we actually exfiltrated about 2 gigs of data over SSH. And the SOC had actually seen this. They saw a spike in SSH data across their edge, and they said, "Okay, we caught you." And it was like, "Great, good, all right, some stuff's working." But you found one of our systems. Like, we have about a half a dozen systems that we still have footholds in. So do you have any visibility into those? And this actually let them practice their incident response for hunting for the threat, not just assuming that, okay, we caught them doing one bad thing, we're done here. It was a really great way for them to be able to practice their we've identified a threat, let's go contain the threat and eradicate the threat completely. And that proved to be a bit more challenging than they thought, but it was a good thing to practice.
So once you've identified some of these indicators that could potentially be insider threats, things like the large exfiltrations of data, either just a super disengaged employee, somebody who's calling in sick a lot, or just not really interested in the work that they've been tasked with, their productivity goes down immensely, or you notice strange activity with their interactions with files and data. What technical controls can we put around those users that we suspect are potential insider threats that can help to either confirm that or to prevent them from doing anything that would be damaging to the organization?
Yeah, on a more, I suppose, rudimentary level might just be, let's say, go back to perhaps that ransomware example, or perhaps the exfil. I think it applies to both of those scenarios, actually. There's the ability for most operating systems to audit file object level access and actually log it. So, from a more rudimentary standpoint, perhaps there's just a logging policy on the system that reports on file touches, and typically maybe in the course of a behavior's or a user's behavior in a day, maybe they touch 20 unique objects. So kind of benchmarking that, understanding what the acceptable user behavior is, and then kind of putting that threshold in place so that if the logging system detects a rapidity of file object touches, it could indicate that they're, iterating over all of that stuff to either, one, in the ransomware scenario, encrypt it, or perhaps two, to gather all those files, put them in an encrypted zip format, and then exfiltrate them out of the organization. So that's, I think, perhaps a more rudimentary solution would just be relying on some of the operating system level controls there. And then on the more sophisticated, there are some vendors out there that sell these sort of behavioral analytics solutions that'll essentially provide a mostly out-of-the-box working solution that does what the rudimentary version I just described was, where it'll kind of automatically establish those behavioral analytics, and you can put users in various types of policies that kind of support their behavior. And then as soon as they step outside of that, you would get an alert from this security solution if it's configured properly, of course.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Moving into our offensive security services, we're going to highlight the incident response tabletops that we perform here for clients. Our red team puts together tabletop scenarios that are based in real attacks, things that we have seen either out in the wild or that our red team have perpetrated against our clients. We put these together as a hypothetical tabletop discussion that we conduct either over virtual meeting software or in person. And the purpose of this is to allow teams to practice and validate their incident response policies, plans, procedures, and playbooks that they may have created to combat social engineering tactics that could be used against the organization, and ransomware and other similar themed attack scenarios that are worth practicing from the standpoint of preparedness. And I'll pass it to the panel to discuss network testing.
Yeah, on the network testing side of things, I think Rob touched on a really interesting point just around working closely with whoever your internal team or security vendor may be as it relates to pen testing to get the most value out of it. So instead of, maybe traditionally, if you take into account some of the hacker stereotypes of being introverts and not communicating, that's really not the best way to approach a pen test. The best way is to openly communicate with clients, share exactly what we're doing, so that some of these things that we are doing, these preventative and detective controls, can be kind of tested from both sides. If we're doing a password spraying attack on an internal network, does the blue team SOC actually see 20,000 failed authentication attempts over the course of a day, and the one successful authentication attempt, so that they know to cycle out that password? If they're not aware of that attack, They probably don't. If the pen test team isn't actually communicating that that's ongoing, so that perhaps the blue team SOC can do some introspection in their logs. Maybe they find out that they're gathering the events, but they're not actually making any sort of alerts. Maybe they figure out that they're getting the alerts, but nobody's actually looking at them. Maybe they're figuring out that they're getting the alerts, somebody's looking at them, but they don't know what to do with them because they don't have an incident response playbook. So there's a lot of value that I think, both in the context of red teaming and just kind of the more traditional network pen testing, that can be realized just by working in a very active manner with your internal team or security vendor. You know, it should not be this sort of black magic thing where knowledge is kept close to the chest. These sort of engagements really should be a knowledge sharing opportunity with clients, just so that they have a better idea of exactly what's being done, and then they can thus configure their systems better. And that's, I think, the whole idea of what should be the whole idea of the kind of security ecosystem here is just, make the clients better, do the work in a way that gives the client value, and, not talking to the client is not the best way about that. So yeah, quite a few things that I think could be done there to just get more value out of a traditional network test there.
And question for the panel, how do proactive offensive security services such as red teaming and network testing aid in the mitigation of social engineering based attacks and restricting movement across the networks?
Going into these types of tests with your specific goals, your specific success criteria and outcomes that you want to see in mind will set them up for the most possible value that you can get out of them. For social engineering specifically, having the specific playbook prepared, and if you haven't built an incident response plan and you haven't built a playbook specific to social engineering, you may want to consider doing a tabletop exercise with your team first to think through the either common scenarios you're already facing, the future scenarios you expect to face, such as like a ransomware incident, but you're exploring what those initial access vectors are that you most want to be prepared to defend against. And actually doing a live fire exercise can help your team practice that. One of the things I think that's really valuable about our deliverables, especially in the red team, is they aren't a list of findings. They aren't a just go fix this, this, and this, and you'll be okay. They are an analysis of your controls, and they are an analysis of this, your plan and your playbook, and giving you insights into were your detection controls, were your prevention controls effective or not, or are there opportunities for improvement? And that can be a really prescriptive way to just get better, and you can always be getting better. And so I'd say the more you invest in practicing these things, the more opportunities you'll identify to improve. The penetration testing is great for if you want to do a vulnerability assessment and get as many issues identified to fix as possible, or if you want to do a true penetration test and answer the question, can someone break in here? And what is the easiest path to break in? Or what is if we go deep in a certain area, what issues can we identify that can be either remediated, or where can we add additional mitigation controls? So these complement each other really well.
And a question for the panel. When we talk about red teaming, network pen testing, vulnerability assessments, a lot of companies use these terms interchangeably. How would you prescribe the use of vulnerability assessments, network pen testing, and red teaming based on the organization's security maturity of their program, size of the organization, and any other factors that would help to influence your decision as far as recommending where to start and then what the eventual goal would be as they mature over time?
I think that there are options for each of these for every organization and every maturity level. Sometimes a new director of security or even a new CISO comes into it, their role, and needs to answer the question, like, I need the list of every vulnerability, even lows and medium risk things, just so I know the lay of the land, and I can build a backlog of things to work on fixing, and maybe go justify the budget to invest in fixing these things. Sometimes a penetration test is needed because you're trying to, you've already invested in locking down the environment, and you want to basically, you want to basically at that point test its resiliency, and you want to see what is going to be the way that it's going to fail. And then the red team is most valuable for practicing your incident response, having your blue team go through a live fire exercise, practice for the fight that they're already in or going to be in soon. Think of it as a sparring session. So I think those are great ways to use each of these services.
Yeah, and just one quick addition there. I would say, if you don't even know what security is, start with that vulnerability assessment. Once everything is kind of indexed, I do look at penetration testing as kind of the ability to tie out perhaps discrete vulnerabilities into more meaningful impacts. And then, of course, yeah, for the more mature security organizations, the red team side of things.
All right, we have a quick example of how we put together tabletop exercises. In the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to our last slide here. I think we've had an excellent discussion today, and I did go quickly over what a tabletop exercise entails, but essentially we put together a very convincing attack based on the organization's own environment and make that highly customizable so that the participants can fully engage and immerse themselves in the attack scenario rather than finding ways to dispel whether or not this would actually happen in their environment. But if we can move it on to the next slide, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up by discussing our research and insights. We have many reports as well as white papers and other resources available on our website. We also have these webinars and blog articles and other resources available on our website that will detail things wide-ranging from our Cosmos platform all the way through to our red teaming and how to do that right. We offer a red team coaching service as well, where we help companies set up their own internal red teams and coach them through that process. And we also have other insight into the methods of modern adversaries, that adversarial mindset, how attackers are approaching organizations, and more on social engineering, as well as the technical sides of those things. Anything else that the panel would like to contribute as we close our session out today?
Nothing else. So here, all out of words, I think.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to my panel for their insights and contributions to the discussion today. Thank you for your questions. You're welcome to follow up with us after the fact if we weren't able to get to your question today. And once again, thank you for joining us and making time in your busy days to hang out with us for a bit.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.